is that rook on b1 had no moves on that last rank. So you had to trade. The rook was actually trapped in place. Magnus Carlsen strikes back. He wins the first game of 3+1. That is huge for his chances.
That is just what the doctor ordered. I'll just contribute to what you just said by mentioning that when the rook moved away from e5, the knight on f6 became pinned. You couldn't use it for counterplay, and black was out of resources. And very interesting development here. They are repeating the opening from game 1 of the match. Who is going to deviate first? Or is Hikaru just saying, hey, I'm more than happy with a draw?
Kind of an interesting decision, I think.
Wow.
Maybe not
Look at this.
Great one.
Look at that. Well, black was the one pushing here, wasn't he?
I mean, Hikaru must have looked at it, right?
He must have looked at it, but is this really what he wants to do, to get a position where it, Magnus seems to be the one drawing from a position of strength? I guess Hikaru has looked at it to the point where he feels super confident that he can deprive black of any remaining chances.
Bishop c2. That allowed knight d4 check, but king g3 was there, and that's when Magnus played g5. But bishop takes h7 was a possibility.
And it is again. It's just a blunder. Knight e2 check, I guess, is his point, but then you go king f3, and white's better in that endgame, because at the end of the line, Robert, you're going to go rook d6 and hit the pawn. Magnus looks puzzled. What's he doing?
I don't really know, because when you play something, you expect your opponent to look at it. So I think Magnus could have spent a little bit more time before venturing into the same exact variation. Now, it's only one pawn. And I say only, not because it's not a big deal, but because in many rook endgames, being just one pawn down still gives great chances to draw. So, Donnie, I do think that this game is much closer to equal than any sort of advantage for white. I just am a bit confused by this whole repetition of the game.
And this was unnecessary, right? You didn't have to do this to yourself. And now Magnus is on the defensive, but handily drawing with that knight being as active as it is. We should point out, Robert, to those just joining, first of all, welcome to the party. We're glad you're here. But the reason they played this quickly is because they had the exact same opening up to move 24 in game 1 of the match. So as impressive as it looks, they're following a well-trodden path, a path that they themselves had laid out before.
That's right. Bishop goes back to d3, and knight to f3 will win the pawn on h2, but white will then slide the king up to g2. That's very important. You don't want to get checkmated in the corner, because knight f3 actually threatens checkmate in 1.
An Arabian mate is not going to be on the menu in this game. Knight f3, king g2, and if you greedily capture h2, white can play f3, locking the knight, and now the knight is checkmated on h2.
That would not be good at all. So Magnus thinking he can play pawn to c5 just to protect the knight on d4, but that does loosen your control of the b5 pawn. I like c5, but I think white should respond with b3, and that way you are not allowing the pawn to keep pushing.
And perhaps white can play b4 to beat black to the punch. Of course, the pawn on b4 then becomes itself a liability. So game is kind of hanging in the balance. The Magnus that we're used to, Robert, has no problem drawing these kinds of positions. I think he will have no problem holding, but something makes me a little bit nervous.
Yeah, it's the fact that he repeated a line. Bishop takes h7 happen. He's playing relatively quickly. His king goes to f6. Look at Hikaru. This is the type of game that he wins against most anybody, but the problem is Magnus Carlsen isn't just anybody. He is the best player on the planet. He plays c5. The knight is defended. So, Daniel, let me ask you, are there any winning chances for either side here?
At first I was going to say yes, and I'm influenced by the course of this match. I look at the knight on d4 a little bit more carefully, and, the Soviet GM inside of me would say, with such a knight on d4, you cannot lose. It is crime to lose with knight like this on d4. So perhaps I can play b4 and lock up the queen pawns entirely. Of course, the drawback of that move is that your own pawn chain loses its mobility. So Magnus keeping his options open and preparing to swing his rook to a8.
Which might win a pawn if you're not careful. And the one pawn on g5 takes care of both of white's pawns on the f and h file. That's the problem with having split pawns. Isolated pawns are not ideal. And if rook a8, I guess bishop b1 is Hikaru's plan. A very passive defense, but it's a defense that gets the job done.
Now, wait a minute. Hello, the pawn appears on c4. That's the first passed pawn of the game. And white's going to get a corresponding passer on a2. Robert, not the greatest passed pawn in the history of passed pawns. If white's not careful, I could actually see Magnus making a sudden push to play for the win. Am I delusional here?
You're not delusional, but I do think there are ways to force a draw. For example, even if it costs white a bishop, as long as you trade off the remaining black pawns, it would still
Mm-hmm.
be a draw. So I think you can take it by rook c4, as I say rook c3.
Ooh. What now? Is he going to try to trade the pawns preemptively so that you can then give the bishop up for c2? And listen, a knight and rook versus rook, it's not a given that you draw it with 5 seconds on your clock. So can Magnus milk Hikaru's clock down? I think that'll be his only chance to turn this game around and actually win it.
So should he go rook c8 here? Just try to push
B8.
that pawn.
Rook b8,
Rook
I guess
B8.
he can go back to e4 even, counterattacking the knight.
Yeah, that's just equal. So this rook e4 idea is frustrating for black to deal with.
And you can't play c3. There are no forks. The king is very well placed on g2. It's out of the checking zone of the black knight. Rook c8, your call.
And if knight b5, there might be rook f3 check, and then a4. But now if rook f3, there's knight f4 check. So you just block the check with another check, and then push the pawn.
But now can you check and play c3? You got to be careful not to lose that pawn, because white's king could suddenly make a mad dash toward the queen side.
Black is definitely better here. This is uncomfortable to play with 47 seconds.
Yeah. And Hikaru trying to whip up some counterplay with his own passer, distracting black from the c8 square, but the king can move into d4. Oh, and then there's h4, undermining the knight. Watch out for that tactic.
Although c3 is so tempting right here, and then bring the knight back around. He goes, watch out for 91. That's a fork.
Hikaru avoided that with a 10-foot bull. He's like, I'm moving out of there.
But king takes g5 is not a threat, because rook g8 check, the king has to go to the side of the board. That seems uncomfortable.
Magnus recognizes it. Rook e2 check opens up an attack on the knight, but the king slides into d4. Here comes Hikaru's pawn. We've got a good old-school pawn race. And
We
20
do,
seconds on the clock for Magnus.
King d4, finally king takes g5 looks good for white. You probably have to take that at some point. But Magnus, by the way, down to 18 seconds.
Yeah, this is a 3-result game. I know it sounds crazy, but Hikaru is known to create crazy chances in these positions. There's a case in point. Rook e4 is a threat. You got to move the knight. And he does.
King g5, knight takes f3 is check, and then knight goes to d2.
Uh-oh, intercepting the rook and stopping rook e4 check. Still a draw, but Hikaru's got to be careful.
a5 is falling. Maybe throwing rook a6 first, but he takes the pawn at h4, h5.
The other pawn.
Yeah, it's crazy.
I think Magnus has to be careful here. That pawn moves really fast, and c3 is restrained by the bishop.
So rook f1 check first, and he wants rook h1 at some point, but maybe he's just making a draw here.
I think it's time to make a draw. With 9 seconds on the clock, no need for Magnus to do anything crazy.